16. Early the next morning, Chesney was the first to wake up. It had been a long night, but he always had a hard time sleeping when he knew he had something he needed to do. For 2 days and nights, they rested. Who knew what kind of timeline they were really under? There wasn't a countdown to the end of the world, convenient for all to see. It made him always paranoid, though, that something terrible would happen if he stopped moving. The sword caught his eye. Since he had first seen it, it had never left his side, barely ever out of his grip. He was terrified that he would look away and it would be gone, like it had never been there to begin with. His eyes lingered on the grip. Cormu had touched that grip. This was a blade from the heavens above, a holy weapon of Rega. His every use of it felt like blasphemy, like a child stealing his father's sword, using it like a toy. But more than anything, having the sword here in his possession was always terrifying. Like the inexorable pull of gravity, his hand fell upon the handle, and picked it up. Soundlessly, the millennia-old blade slid out of the sheath. The tip trembled in the light from his unconscious movements. He tried so hard to suppress the fear he felt near it, but his grip always betrayed him. This was a symbol of hope for the people of Lennis, and he wanted so desperately to be that symbol, knew that it was expected of him, required, even. He had come to terms with that long ago, when he had spoken to Daphne. But how can you be a beacon of hope when you were so terrified of failure? A god had used this blade to slay a dragon, and countless other feats of bravery. A god had lifted Lennis out of a dark age, and into the light, carrying this sword. But Chesney wasn't a god. He wasn't even a man. He was a stupid child who had made a mistake that doomed the world, scrambling for any way to save it and take back what he had done. There is no one else, Chesney. That's all there is to it. It's you. It's only you. You can't give up. The tip trembled in the light. He sheathed the sword and tied it once again to his waist. You don't have the luxury of wallowing in self-pity. He checked and rechecked his kit. Still no one else was awake. He kept looking back at Medea, willing her to wake up, but he couldn't bring himself to take what little rest she allowed herself. Wild was nearby, sprawled out like a shag carpet, limbs splayed every which way and snoring loudly. She didn't do anything by half measures, it seems. Frustrated and full of energy, he bent himself to the task of getting breakfast ready. He'd been thinking of what to do next, decided, and was now very eager to put his plan into action. When he was moving forward, it was so much easier to manage himself. Eventually, the smell of sizzling eggs and cured meats began to rouse the occupants. It wasn't long before people started helping him along, and very soon they were all seated and dining amicably. Mouth full of something, Wild asked.
So, big guy, what's the plan? We going to search the whole continent for Cormu's helmet? Well, soon, yes. We will need to ask around to find out where it is, if we can. But first,
he said, but was interrupted by Himoen.
Oh, wait. Is that why you guys are here? Looking for Cormu's helm?
Chesney nodded.
Yes. And the armor too. We already have this.
He brandished Cormu's sword, still in its scabbard.
We need the full set to stop what's coming.
Himoen's eyes widened.
Get out. That's the real sword. I've always wanted to see it. See all of them, really.
Her eyes went all dreamy.
Cormu always sounded so dashing in the stories.
Carice chimed in as well.
Well, if you're looking for the helm, it's actually really close by.
The trio turned to her. Medea, mouth also full, swallowed her half-chewed food hard and said,
Really? Can you tell us about it? Oh, for sure. A ways out east, by the coast, there's this place that's something between a fortress and a museum. It's called the Consecrated Grounds, and Sasquatch keeps many relics from the Reagans there.
Himoen whined.
Ooh, I've always wanted to go there to see the helm myself, but the security there is really strict and they won't let anyone in.
She perked up with an idea.
Wait, if you're going to get it, would you please come back here and show it to me?
Chesney shrugged.
I don't see why not. But hold on, first we have to.
He started once more, but was interrupted again. Fast Joe, the man who had come fishing with him, stood up.
On that note, I actually had a proposal I wanted to bring up to you, young man. Chesney, after our long excursion yesterday, and you told me about everything you faced so far, and what's left to be done, I just couldn't let it go. Sasquatch is a wretched place, especially for people like me and my friends, and this is a chance to change that.
Fast Joe brandished a well-cared-for cutlass, eyeing it with a surprisingly somber air.
I won't slow you down, I promise. I'm a spiritualist as well. What do you say? Well, I don't mind, Fast Joe, but are you sure this is what you want? Don't you have a life here?
Fast Joe nodded and gave an easy smile.
Undoubtedly. But I have my reasons for wanting to join as well. The faster the crisis affecting the world is resolved, the faster me and my friends will be able to return to doing what we love. Isn't that right, everyone?
There were cheers and hears all round. Chesney looked over to Medea to gauge her opinion. There was something about Fast Joe that seemed to hint that there was more to the man than being a simple performer.
What do you think, Medea?
She had hardly met the man, but it always felt so foreign to just decide without hearing her thoughts. When he caught her eye, she jumped a little, but said,
Oh, yes, I don't mind.
He was confused at her reaction, but quickly forgot about it. There were far more important things on his mind he wanted to get to discussing.
All right then, welcome aboard, glad to have you, Fast Joe.
Wild grinned and raised a glass.
All right, concentrated ground, here we come. Let's go steal some crap.
Medea giggled.
Consecrated, wild, consecrated grounds.
Chesney gripped the table and bonked his forehead into it in frustration.
No, we're not doing that.
Medea turned to him in total surprise.
What do you mean?
He sighed and crossed his arms.
I've been trying to say it all morning. Before we go running off on the next step of our quest, we have a bigger problem to solve. You must know what I mean, right, Medea?
Her face flushed a little at being called to answer. She looked over at Wild for assistance, but the other girl just shrugged.
I don't understand, Chesney. What problem? We are too weak. Far too weak. We almost died fighting a bunch of wild animals. What are we going to do when we're up against Zagos' forces?
Medea bit her lip.
I'm not arguing with you, but what are you getting at? We need to train.
He pointed to the open tent flap.
I want us out there every day, for as long as it takes, training up against the worst this continent can throw at us, until we can bring down monsters like those without blinking an eye.
He searched her face, hoping she thought his idea was sound. He could almost follow her train of thoughts as he watched her expression change. Eventually, she nodded.
Yes, you're right. It's so obvious now. I should have thought of it and suggested it myself.
A frown developed on her face. He shook his head.
It's not wrong to be focused on the end goal. Wild. Fast Joe, do you have any problems with that plan?
Fast Joe shrugged and shook his head easily.
I look forward to showing you what I can really do.
Wild looked a bit apprehensive. All her joy and exuberance shrank away in an instant until she was like a deflated balloon. In a whisper, she asked,
Will we have to face those big things again?
A flash of memory, and he was back there, watching as the jaws wrapped around him and enveloped him in crushing darkness.
Yeah.
Her face fell just a fraction, but she then put on a determined face, and said,
Okay.
Her expression never quite made it all the way, though. The first day, they lost most of their time just trying to track down the best locations to find creatures to train against, with Fast Joe along, though a lot of the mysteries of the creatures were made known to them, including their names, Microrettes, Splitbugs, Twin-head birds, and the Terror Rex. Even so, they were still tripping over each other in combat, and taking more wounds than necessary. They hardly fared much better than they had done before. The second day, Media had the idea that they could fight more effectively if they didn't have to shout out so many decisions or actions. If they knew the game plan ahead of time, it would be far more efficient. At first, they simply divided different types of opponents. Fastjo couldn't fight the split bugs, so Midia and Chesney took turns peppering them with magic, while Fastjo took care of the Microts and wild the birds. They still got in each other's way from time to time, but by the time evening came, they were smiling. Everyone was off unwinding after the exertions of the day. Everyone except Chesney. Every fight was still playing over in his mind. Things were working better, but he wasn't convinced that it wasn't just due to the familiarity with the foes they were fighting. He needed to be convinced that when they faced a new enemy, they could work just as smoothly. On the third day, Chesney made it a point to get them into complicated situations. Bad terrain, larger groups of enemies, and luring terror Rexes into combat while they were still recovering. As he predicted, these situations ended up exposing flaws in their delegation of work. This was all false progress. After supper that night, he took Midia aside away from the tent and brought his concerns forward. Now it was her turn to pace back and forth. After a time, she began to talk through her line of thinking.
Up until recently, we've been fighting on instinct. We reacted to situations, and to a point that's worked fine. But the major danger there is when instinct leads us to make poor decisions, like with the Terror Rexes when we got to Sasquatch.
Chesney tilted his head.
But there wasn't any way for us to know there were such huge creatures here beforehand. We had no idea there was anything to avoid. When we fight them now, it goes much better.
She shook her head.
No, that's not what I mean. Our first instinct was to hide, and then run. Running almost got us killed. If we had stayed to fight in that collection of boulders, we would have had a major advantage. So, you're saying we need to make smarter snap decisions?
She shook her head.
No. I'm saying that we were confused when caught off guard. There was no source of truth. We were paralyzed by indecision. Then, we went down the list of options: hide, run, and fight, until one worked. We lost all our advantages because we were running on instinct.
She bit her lip, looked up at him.
What we need is leadership.
He reacted almost as if he had been struck. Immediately her hands went up in a defensive manner.
Wait. I'm not saying you're a bad leader, Chesney. What we need to do is have our first instinct to look to you for orders. If we don't, we will always be reacting, always be on the back foot. Right now, if you say fight, and I say run, what happens? Chaos. I would turn to fight with you, but then someone would run, and then get confused when I wasn't running.
It was Chesney's turn to pace again.
But if I'm rattling off orders the whole battle, we'll be so slow. Not to mention, I won't be able to keep an eye on everything all the time. Wasn't the whole point of the delineation of duty to cut down on the number of orders we had to shout out? Exactly. We're looking at two solutions to the same problem, and treating them like they're different solutions, when really, they're two halves of the same whole. That's what I mean by leadership. Chesney, we need for you to say a word, and for us to instantly know your intent, and carry it out. So when you say spread out, we already know who's going left, who's going right, and what targets to take. When you point at an enemy, and say to distract him, who's going to be doing that, and how?
She stepped in front of him, and gingerly took his hands into hers. The look in her eyes was a mix of emotions he couldn't piece apart.
We need you to turn us into a fighting unit. No, not a fighting unit. Your fighting unit.
The words felt like an anchor around his neck, the sword tied to his hip like a belt of barbed wire. He took his hands from Midia's, and covered his face, breathing slowly.
So, I'm not doing enough. I'm still not doing enough. Is that it?
Her voices sounded bruised.
No, Chesney, I'd never say that.
He rounded on her.
Well, did it ever occur to you that I'm not a leader? Real leaders are confident, and brave, and strong, decisive. They always have a plan. They don't make mistakes. Who would possibly want to follow me? I'm a kid, playing pretend knights with a stick. You're so much more than that, Chesney. You've already done so much already, but you can't even see it. This is just the next step,"
she whispered, holding her hands to her chest. A dozen biting remarks were born and died on his lips. Didn't she understand how ill-suited he was for what she was asking him to be? How that kind of reliance on him would just get everyone killed?
"Think back, Chesney. You're always keeping watch over us, always thinking of the next steps, the big picture. Your idea to train was a great one. That's the kind of decision leaders make. And you can do this, Chesney. I believe in you, with everything I have. I wish you could see what I see when I look at you."
Eyes filled with desperation and sorrow looked back at him in the light of the stars. If it was anyone else asking him to take on this role, he would have argued and fought and cried and begged. Anything to not have to shoulder another burden on top of his growing pile of consequences. But this was Medea who was asking. All the fire and anger ebbed away and left his body feeling burnt out and quiet. She was right. She was always right, when he needed it most. He had work to do, before the morning.
"All right,"
he said.
"I get it."
He couldn't quite look at her this moment. He needed time. He contained himself long enough to say,
"I need some time to think. Go get some sleep, okay?"
He stalked off, out into the night. He had until the morning to really understand what it meant to be a leader, and how to command. "I wish I could see what you see, too, Medea." He left behind a girl who hated herself for knowing what was needed, knowing how much it might cost, and doing it anyway. Day 4 started very poorly. He hadn't slept. The single glance he allowed himself at Medea and her red eyes told him she hadn't either. Wild could sense the awkwardness in the air and was rather subdued herself, and Fastio was just unfailingly polite as always, as if he was oblivious to the whole situation. He probably wasn't, but points for him for being a good sport about it. It had been a long night. He knew that if he took up this role, really took it up, it would change a lot of things in subtle ways. It would be painful for everyone, including himself. It would mean becoming the greatest actor in fraud. But he would do it if it meant everyone would go home safe, and they did what needed to be done.
"Hi, everyone,"
he began. He looked each of them in the eyes as he spoke, making sure to hold it even when his insides squirmed and cringed.
"I spent some time last night thinking on how we've been doing."
He made sure to not mention Medea in this process. He needed to own this decision, in front of everyone. If people needed to instinctually look to him for direction, it started with every word, every gesture.
"You've all been performing excellently out there, but I've been letting you down."
Medea looked down. Wild tilted her head and said,
What are you talking about, big guy?"
Even Fastio had a kind word.
"Oh, come now, Chesney, what's this nonsense? In short, we're inefficient, and that's my fault. I've been leaving decisions I should be taking on myself up to other people. So, I've come up with some plans on how we can fight more cohesively going forward."
He went on to explain how they would be training today. A few simple commands, and what they meant. What to do when they were ambushed. Priorities to always keep in mind. Now that they had a full team, Medea had to be protected at all costs. While they all had healing bottles handy, she was still their primary source of healing, and if she went down, the consequences were dire. Fastio and Chesney would be in front. Wild would always stay out of the fray and try to flank with her arrows or magic as opportunities presented themselves, or to cover the rear. The first few encounters went well, but it was still awkward. Chesney wasn't used to giving orders, especially when they were simple and repetitive. Their strength over the last few days had grown considerably, and the local wildlife was posing much less of a threat. But that was okay. They needed to get used to it on the easy encounters, so it would natural on the harder encounters. During a rest, Chesney felt odd. Taking on this role of actual leader rather than leader by default made him feel oddly apart from everything. He didn't like it. He liked it much better when he felt more like equals with everyone. and conversation came more easily. He sat down beside Medea, who was laying against a tree with her eyes closed.
How am I doing?
He asked. She gasped awake.
Wah! Oh, Chesney. I'm sorry, I must have dozed off. What did you say? I was wondering how I was doing with my first day on the job.
She smiled, genuinely.
I think you're doing a great job, Chesney. I know it feels weird, but haven't you noticed the changes? Notice what changes? Look at Wild. Remember how panicked she was, knowing we would have to fight those Rexes again? And the way she would hesitate between targets when we would get swarmed? And when you look at her now, she's focused and alert. And that's because she knows exactly what to do, and when.
Thinking back, she was right. He'd been quite preoccupied trying to make sure he didn't make a fool of himself. He hadn't quite paid enough attention to how everyone else was doing, but nobody had gotten in anyone's way today so far. He bit his lip. He was going to ask the question, knowing full well that regardless of the answer it wouldn't change anything.
And, what about you? Are you really okay with me ordering you around like this? You've never exactly struck me as the kind of person who need to be told what to do. Considering this was my idea, I'd be a pretty poor second in command if I did. That's not really an answer. You're right, sorry. But the answer is no, I don't mind. If I'm being absolutely honest, I find it freeing in a way. Because of what you were in Ratsert, right?
She nodded. She opened her mouth to say something else, but it never quite got out. Her face twisted into some expression, and back again.
What is it? You can tell me anything, Medea, you know that. I know. Don't worry, it's nothing. We can talk about it later. You're doing a good job, Chesney.
She got up and dusted herself off.
Should we get going?
He knew there was something she was hiding. He could push her on it. But something about the wounded look on her face made him believe that it might be better to wait like she wanted. Whatever it was, he trusted her enough to know that it wouldn't get in the way of what they had to do. Still, he was a little hurt that she felt the need to hide anything at all. They'd come a long way together and shared a lot of pain. But maybe some pains were still too hard to share with anyone. The rest of that day went excellently. With the small confidence boost that Medea had given him, he was able to focus just a bit more and recognize those times when he didn't need to give orders at all. He was beginning to understand that, on those times, it felt like before, when everyone fought as one, as equals. It made him feel a bit hopeful that his worries were perhaps largely unfounded. He decided that this new path forward needed a stress test. It was getting late in the day, and while they had fought a lot, they weren't too terribly taxed that they couldn't fight more. And so, as a final test, he deliberately led them into the worst encounter he could find. Swarms of splitbugs, a whole flock of twin heads, and another mated pair of terror rexes. All at once. Like when they stumbled upon a pair of ellipsaurs fighting over territory in the middle of a heliopod nest. Only worse.
All right, everyone. This is it. This is the chance to prove ourselves,
he shouted, brandishing Cormu's sword almost like a banner while their enemies noticed them and began to stir in their frenzy at being disturbed.
Medea, terrify. Wild, distract. Fastjo, rear guard. And I'll go over the top. Go.
Like a well-oiled machine, they set into motion. Wild and Medea pressed their hands to Chesney, as he also did to himself, and filled him with supportive magic. Then, they broke off and began their work. Medea would rotate between freezing their enemies in time, blasting them with wide-area chain lightning bolts, and keeping herself whole with the crown. She, more than anyone, could afford to be relentless with her spellcasting with little fear to her life. Wild would always be to the side of the conflict, peppering arrows into any creature that was about to try to strike at one of their friends. If she ever got too much attention, Fastjo was there to protect her. Fastjo was flitting between positions, turning away attacks, and striking when the opportunity presented itself the whole time. He was acting like an all-rounder, taking up the task of doing whatever the situation needed at the time. And as for Chesney, he was too fast to even watch. A glowing ribbon of light danced through the battle, never stopping, never even slowing. He was impossible to glimpse. In the wake of the gleaming weapon, limbs fell, gashes opened, blood flowed. Incredible, impossible leaps would take him soaring into the air to strike a swooping bird, or crash down onto the back of a Rex.
Getting penned in here,
Wild called, forced to be back-to-back with Medea as the swarms of enemies regrouped and caught them off guard. Fast Joe found himself separated when one of the Rexes broke away from Chesney.
Everyone, down!
Chesney called, kicking off the ground, then into the side of one of the huge beasts, and into the air. They all dropped to the ground instantly, covering themselves. The ribbon stopped for just a fraction of a moment in the air.
Blow up!
He cried. The air filled with miniature explosions, blowing into almost every single enemy, and giving everyone the breathing room they needed.
Fast Joe, take that one,
he said, pointing to the staggering Rex that Chesney had kicked off from. He ran to the much more healthy-looking Rex.
You two, clean up! You got it, boss!
Wild whooped, letting out a stream of arrows, back-to-back with Medea, dishing out strong single bolts to the near-dead targets. Fast Joe, quick on his feet, ducked in and out of the wounded Rex's vision, always keeping it guessing where he was, flashing at it constantly when it would turn away in confusion, until finally getting right underneath and slashing open its throat. Seconds later, it fell, unable to rise. Chesney, like an unstoppable force, jumped up to his Rex's head, striking it with a pommel and disorienting it. Then he dipped under the Rex, slashing tendons, opening bowels, turning and carving up from groin to chin. A moment of silence followed as everyone looked around, taking stock, wondering if they had truly won this seemingly near impossible fight so easily. Of course it was Wild who broke the silence, hollering their victory.
Yeah! By the seas, did you just see us do that? We were like so freaking cool.
She looked at her hands in amazement.
And, I was even cool. I didn't even know I could do stuff like that. I hit 2 birds with 1 arrow. On purpose. And I don't think I missed a single shot.
Fast Joe twirled his mustache, which was somehow still perfect, saying,
I must admit, that was quite a lot of fun. I've worked with others before, but this is the first time I think I understood what it means to be part of a team.
Medea giggled and elbowed Wild.
Well, it probably makes it a little easier to hit them when they can't move.
Wild put her hands on Medea's shoulder, pretending to glower.
Don't you take this away from me, girl.
Chesney wiped off his sword, slid it into his scabbard, and turned to the group with an absolutely beaming face.
Everyone, that was incredible. You shattered my expectations. I can hardly believe how far we've come in just a few days.
Fast Joe leaned in conspiratorially.
I hope you're including yourself in that assessment, young man. Oh my world, yes!
Wild said, turning and shaking Chesney by the shoulders as well, unable to contain her excitement.
Did you even see yourself out there? For half a second it felt like I was watching something right out of legend. You were like a tornado of death out there.
His smile turned humble, and he looked down.
Well, if I was, it was all thanks to you 3. Knowing I could count on you? It meant everything. I could finally, focus. It felt incredible, like I finally knew where to put my feet, and where to move, and how they were going to move. I wasn't scared.
He looked over to Medea and shrugged and said,
It felt right.
Medea wrapped him in a hug, which he gratefully returned.
I'm so proud of you, Chesney,
she whispered.
Ooh, you 2 are so damn cute. I'm going to die.
Wild cheered.
Group hug. Group hug.
Chesney was suddenly crushed between them both. He managed to say, with his last breath,
Well, if this is how I die, I guess that's okay.
Wild slapped the back of his head.
Oh, you cheeky thing.
She then turned to Fast Joe, reaching out,
You getting in on this group hug?
He barked a laugh and said,
I'm going absolutely nowhere near that.
After their success, they headed back for a well-deserved rest. That night, at the tent, spirits were high. In the back of Chesney's mind, countless worries had been unconsciously piling up the longer they stayed. Were the minstrels growing tired of them? Would the people of Barsis come find them? Would they get seriously hurt out there while training? And then, his own attempts at learning how to lead, and the upcoming mission. But none of his unspoken fears came to pass. And now, all that was left was the consecrated grounds mission. For the first time in a very long time, he felt confident in his plan and progress. He told everyone that training was over, and that tomorrow, they would all head east. For once in longer than he could recall, he actually had a good sleep. The next day, they set out east after a hearty breakfast. The plains they walked were penned in by the coast to the north, mountains to the south and far east, and rolling hills in between. Following the hills, they headed towards the far-off mountains. According to Fastjo and the map, the consecrated grounds were just past them.
Ugh, why is everything so dreary here?
Wild said, gesturing around them.
The dirt is gray, the mountains are dark purple, the trees are green. Gross.
Nearby, Fastjo asked,
Oh, and what is it like up in Nasquat? I can't say I've ever been. Always wanted to see it, actually. Oh, well, the soil is a lot more like this yellow, sandy color, for starters. It's usually quite bright and hot most days, since we don't actually get a lot of cloud cover. The trees are a beautiful mixture of ocean and sky blue, and the mountain rock is this amazing, almost iridescent green. Okay. Now I'm homesick. Thanks a lot. Fascinating. I wonder why the northern and southern hemispheres of the planet are so different, with even different compositions of bedrock.
Midia shrugged.
I guess I've never given it much thought. I do prefer Nasquat, though.
Despite himself, and the treatment he'd received in Sasquatch, Fastjo seemed a bit miffed at all the talk of one continent being better than another.
Well, for my part, Nasquat sounds far too bright and hot for my taste. And blue trees sound so tediously boring. The sky is already that color. No contrast at all.
He got a bit of a dreamy look in his eyes, then said,
When the sun catches the mountains at just that right angle, the whole landscape is just awash with subtle colors. The clouds, bathed in the golden and pink light of sunset, and the mountains glittering their violet hues. It is as if the ground has become a new night sky.
The travel eastward was simple and utterly bereft of challenge for them after their intense training. By noon, they had reached the foot of the mountain and decided to take a break.
You know, Fastjo,
Chesney began between bites of fruit.
I can really see you know how to use that cutlass. It didn't strike me as something a minstrel would be so skilled with the.
Fastjo closed his eyes and nodded.
Wanting to know a bit more about me then, eh? I suppose that's fair. Well, setting aside that my act is juggling swords, so I'd have to be at least a little skilled with them, and that Sasquatch is always dangerous enough to justify anyone being skilled with a weapon, I'll say that I wasn't always a minstrel. Oh, were you a mercenary before?
Midia asked, mouth full. Chuckling softly, Fastjo muttered,
Well, that's close. Not exactly the case, but close enough. But the life was hard and filled with loss. One day I just lost too much, and figured that if I kept down the path I was on, my life would be next. Of course, settling down was completely out of the question. Too much adventurer's blood and all that. I couldn't keep still. So, I put my skills to use in another way, and still got to travel around from place to place by signing on to this troop.
Nodding, Chesney said,
I can see that. You have this way of fighting that almost seems to depend on fighting lots of enemies at once. I wish I could do that. Actually,
Fastjo said, drawing out the blade,
it has more to do with the curve of the weapon than anything. With the weight and curve of it, it's slower and more unwieldy in one-on-one fight, but perfectly made for wide slashing attacks that knock enemies off their guard. The weight and curve work together to not catch on anything, and not stop at slight resistance. Oh, I have a question.
Wild said excitedly, holding her hand in the air.
Are there, any primal local dishes I have to try out while I'm here? I love trying new food, plus the restaurant could use a kick in the repertoire. Well, I don't know. I haven't really been out of Sasquatch to know what counts. I remember a particularly amazing gubbo steak I had in Reykjavik, seasoned with this sauce from crushed red celepsy petals. And there's a particularly well-regarded bakery in Masudo that produces some of the most heavenly loaves of sweet harrow seed bread.
Wild pointed at Chesney.
Chesney, we have to try those. They sound amazing. Yeah, that does sound pretty amazing right now,
Midia added. He threw up his hands in surrender.
Okay, I got it. But, if you recall, we had a pretty bad experience trying to buy anything in Barsis. Do you think any of the other towns will be better?
Fast Joe cleared his throat.
Actually, Barsis is just exceptionally racist. Most other places aren't great either, make no mistake. Barsis grudgingly sells us food, but refuses to sell us any weapons or armor, which is a shame since I've been told they actually make some pretty good stuff. So, anyway, we might have a shot in other towns. See?
Wild and Midia said at the same time, and laughed at how they seemed so incensed. Chesney rolled his eyes.
Man, with you two suddenly getting along so well, I'm doomed. Okay, enough dilly-dallying. We have to get the helmet before we get any sweet rolls. Let's go.
And so they packed up and set off once more. It was only another hour until they spotted a structure off in the distance, framed by the distant blue waters of the eastern coastline. The next hour, they stayed low, hugging the last remaining rolling hills to stay out of sight as much as possible, until they could go no further without revealing themselves. From their vantage point, they could see that the consecrated grounds were oddly a combination between a park, a holy site, museum, and guardhouse. The landscape was lush with long green grasses, and beautiful clear water features that functioned like moats. There were displays with some manner of objects inside, though they couldn't be made out from here. Right in the center was a 2- or 3-story tower built from huge rock blocks, and surrounding the whole grounds was a tall metal fence with barbed wire at the top.
See? Wild. Now, this is a tourist trap,
Chesney joked. She laughed.
Yeah, no kidding. Look at that security.
It had the look of a place that was once a public space, but had recently been turned more fortified. It looked wrong, like a school being patrolled by soldiers. There were patrols of 4 to 6 soldiers walking in changing patterns. Men and women, seemingly almost all Fior-Law with their long ears and polished forehead plates, and all armored and armed.
Fast Joe, do you know where the helm is kept?
Chesney asked. He nodded, and pointed at the tower structure.
Well, last time I was here, tourists were allowed. It was a lot less like an army barracks back then. And since the helm was the best piece here, they kept it in that tower.
Midia tilted her head in thought.
So, is there a reason for why this area is so special? I admit it looks very serene and holy, but why?
He shrugged.
Couldn't tell you. If there was a story to go along with the tour, I don't remember it. More to the point, we need a plan to get in there and take the helm. Does anyone have any suggestions?
Chesney asked, looking to his companions. They all took a moment to think. Fast Joe answered first.
Well, a frontal assault is right out. There's too many patrols there that by the time we dealt with the first obstacle, the whole fort would be on us. Whatever we do, we'll need to be sneaky.
Midia nodded.
Exactly. Easiest would be to send a single person in to steal it. They have the best chance of being not noticed.
Chesney shook his head immediately.
We're not splitting up. If we lose someone, we're screwed. All they'd have to do is wait for us to try a rescue and we'd all be caught. Then, we will have to sneak in all together.
Wild seemed to be getting more and more pensive. Finally, she said,
But how are we even going to get in? The whole place is surrounded by that fence. There's no way we could climb it without being noticed. Let's wait for nightfall. Then, we quietly take out the guards in the front, and then sneak around in the shadows of the displays.
Wild still seemed confused.
But, how would we lure them away? Don't you think they'd be suspicious of anyone coming by so late?
The rest of the group gave her a look of confusion. Chesney said,
Wild, we need to take them out. Kill them, or knock them out at the very least. Kill them? Kill people?
Wild gasped, stepping back. She gripped her bow like it was a security blanket.
No, that's crazy. I can't kill anyone. There's got to be another way. Fast show, this is crazy, right? Tell them they're crazy.
He looked at her with somber pity.
I'm sorry, Miss Wild, but our lives, and the fate of the world, are on the line. We can't take chances.
Her panic was rising. Her eyes darted between all three of them, and her breathing came fast and shallow.
No, there's no way I can. I can't.
Medea bit her lip.
Maybe I should.
She began, but Chesney's hand on her shoulder stopped her. He looked about the same as Fast Joe did.
No, I'll talk to her.
He walked over to Wild, hands up in a show of peace.
Wild, will you take a walk with me? Oh, okay.
She managed. He led her away from the grounds, and through some of the nearby hills.
Take deep breaths. Follow along with me,
he said, leading her through some routines to calm her down as they walked. After a time, she calmed, though she was still pale. For a while they did not talk. At last, the tension got to Wild, and she said,
You must think I'm such a coward. I don't. How could you not? I know there's no other way. But I'm still so scared. Do you think I'm a heartless monster? No, of course not. How could you not? I've just asked you to murder people like it was nothing.
She didn't have a response. Chesney continued.
Wild, nobody sane wants to kill anyone. When this all started, I was just a kid skipping classes. The first time something wanted to kill me, really wanted to kill me, I panicked, completely lost it. I felt sick, feeling my blade sink into their flesh even as they tried to kill me. And later, when Zatra came and caught me freeing Medea, I don't even know if we killed him or just knocked him out. But if someone had told me to finish him off to make sure, there's no way. I just wanted to run, be away from there.
He looked at his hands.
I still remember, though, the first person I killed, and meant to kill. I see her face sometimes when I close my eyes. She looked so surprised. I felt so sick, but Zaran helped me calm down. And then, after that, the revolutionaries from the SAS Quat Diplomatic Corps. I burned them alive. Wild. It was awful, awful stuff.
Wild hung her head and rubbed her shoulder self-consciously.
See? That's my point. You're just a kid, Chesney. And you've been through so much already. I don't have the right to be such a coward. No, Wild. It's the only rational thought. It's not just understandable, it's true. We shouldn't be killing people. It's awful, it's wrong, and it messes you up. I didn't even think of trying to lure them away. Wild. I should have. I know it won't work, but I didn't even think of it. I just jumped straight to killing them.
She looked at him.
Well, where does that leave us, then? What do we do?
He breathed a big sigh.
Unfortunately, we just don't have a choice. We succeed, or we die. Everyone dies. And so I'm going to tell you how to break yourself, to make it okay.
She shivered.
Oh, okay. Are you sure? I want you to be really sure, Wild,
he said, grabbing her shoulders. It felt so odd doing that to someone taller than him, but he had to be strong in this situation.
I won't force you into this. It has to be your choice. And if it's too much for you, you can go on your way. We'll do what we can to help you get home. Give me Give me a minute.
She turned away and bowed her head. He couldn't see what she was doing, but it sounded like a soft prayer. At least, she turned to him, steel in her eyes, and nodded.
Okay. Teach me.
He nodded.
Okay. It's really simple. Not easy, but simple.
He handed her an arrow.
Close your eyes. I want you to imagine you're at home. You're eating, laughing with your family. It's warm and safe. Suddenly, a sneering Fiorella soldier kicks down the door, and before you can even react, he's got a sword raised and is holding down the most precious person in your life. And all you have in your hand is a small kitchen knife. Are you with me so far?
Wild nodded, eyes still closed, gripping the arrow in her hand.
Yes.
He quietly walked behind her. He waited a few moments. Then, he started yelling.
Wild, what are you doing? If you don't do anything, they're going to die. Wild, you're just standing there. Use it. Wild, Wild, use it. Use it. But what? It's them, or you, Wild. Them, or your whole family will die. Are you going to watch them die? Fight. Use the knife.
She screamed, eyes still shut, and thrust the arrow into the air in front of her. He put both hands on her shoulders. She jumped.
Good. Hold on to that feeling.
He could feel the vibrations of her muscles as they tensed under him.
What feeling? Feeling panicked, and confused and scared, and stupid. Exactly. When you feel panicked and confused, just repeat in your mind, them, or me. It's them, or me. Them, or me.
He began leading them back.
Do you think you have it? I don't know, but I'll try.
She looked at him, but the wild exuberance was all gone. He felt cursed and damned.
That's all anyone can do,
he said, trying to sound confident and reassuring, but just feeling pathetic. A week ago, Wild was a tour guide. Now he was turning her into a killer. What was next? He surely did not want to know. Shortly thereafter, they rejoined the group. Medea seemed apprehensive. When they locked eyes, she quickly looked away. What's that about? He wondered. Had he done something? He wanted to ask her about it, but maybe right before a mission wasn't the best time. Or maybe it was the best time, to get it out of the way beforehand. Why is this suddenly so hard? Leadership was a lot easier when he wasn't thinking about doing it. Fast Joe, thankfully, was as easygoing as ever, and welcomed them back with a quick smile and a wink. When he got back, Fast Joe motioned for his attention.
Chetsney, one more thing I thought I should mention. I have magic that lets me teleport us short distances. It's something best used to get out of places when leaving an area would be too hard.
His eyebrows perked up.
Really? That sounds like the perfect exit strategy once we've snuck in and got the helm.
Fast Joe winced somewhat.
Well, yes and no. Unlike some other spells, this one takes a considerable time to cast. How long? A few minutes. Like 2 or so. So, only when we're safe and unnoticed, basically.
Nodding, Fast Joe continued.
Precisely. I just thought you should know, just in case. Both the utility and limitations.
That out of the way, Chetsney looked around and saw that everyone was looking at him. For a heartbeat or two he wondered if he had done something, until it dawned on him that they were looking to him to know what to do next.
Oh. Well, since we should wait until nightfall, why don't we all take a break and sleep until later? That okay with everyone?
It still felt so weird to just tell people to do things. He was so used to everyone doing what was obviously the best course of action that now that he consciously had to think of things and relay his thought, it felt so alien. Everyone agreed. He used his pack as a pillow, curled into his cloak, and closed his eyes. The soft murmurs of the wind through the hills and grasses were both soothing and noisome, so he flitted in and out of sleep, constantly readjusting himself when his limbs became sore. He had to have been asleep, though, because a gentle shake of his shoulders surprised him awake.
What? Huh. Was I snoring?
It was dark. Dark enough that the only light was the stars. It had gotten much colder, and the wind was blowing faster.
Sorry to wake you.
It was Midia's voice.
Can we talk?
He rubbed the sleep from his eyes and sat up, stretching his limbs.
Yeah, for sure. Everything okay?
Her shadowy form sat beside him.
Oh, yeah, everything's fine. I was just wondering about some things. How did it go with Wild? Well, I talked to her about how it's not wrong to be so averse to hurting people, but that we just aren't in a position to be that picky. Walked her through an exercise to help her get over that fear. Probably screwed it up, but who knows? I felt awful about it, but I did it anyway.
Her voice was close and quiet.
Sounds pretty hard, but I wouldn't have minded doing that part to help you, you know? Yeah, I know. But, now that I've started, trying to lead, I feel like I just have to step up every time.
He thought of how everyone looking at him, probably without even realizing they were doing it, waiting for his next order. It's the result he wanted, but he still couldn't help but feel like he lost something in the bargain he couldn't really describe. It was a while before either of them spoke again. At last, it was Midia who broke the silence.
Dedsney,
she began. Her voice sounded strained and with an uncharacteristic tautness to it, pulled tight and ready to break.
Do you hate me?
What? Where is this coming from?
Midia, of course not. Why would you ever think that? Because I pushed you into this. It was my idea. I knew you'd hate it, but I also knew that it's what we had to do, even if it meant that you'd resent me for it.
It was obvious that this had been weighing on her for a while, and he had to tread carefully.
No, Midia. Absolutely not. The thought to blame you for this hadn't ever crossed my mind then. Are you sure? Really look into your feelings, Dedsney. Can you honestly say you don't resent being a leader, and some of that resentment doesn't spill over to me, by association?
Well, that was partly true. He did still somewhat resent being put into this role. It felt like wearing clothes that were 2 sizes too big, and pretending they weren't, and pretending everyone else didn't see how wrong they were too. But it was just inevitable. Of course, things couldn't go as they did forever. He'd come to peace with that, all of it. Once Daphne, that old hag, had given it to him straight. He was the only one. He didn't have much choice. So, he lived with it. Was there a part of him that resented Midia for pushing him even further? He searched his feelings, and there was nothing like that there. She was always there by his side. She could always be counted on, supporting him, giving advice, fighting beside him, protecting him. This journey would have failed without her. He'd be dead without her.
No, not even a little bit. Maybe I should say it a little more often. But, Midia, I depend on you completely. I'd be lost without you. I could never, ever resent you. And I don't. You're the heart of this group, and you're the pillar I lean on when I don't know what to do. Don't forget that, okay?
Slowly, very slowly, she leaned over and rested her head against his shoulder. She whispered,
Thank you.
After a few heartbeats, she straightened and stood.
Well, with that out of the way, we should gather everyone and go. It's so late, it's almost early.
Under the cover of darkness, they approached close to the compound. Bright lights on tall poles bathed the grounds in bright, but patchy, circles of light here and there. Fewer groups of soldiers patrolled around, only occasionally noticeable when they touched upon one of the lit areas. 2 big lights lit the entrance, where 2 tired-looking Fiorella soldiers stood, leaning against the fence posts. The split into 2 groups, Dedsney and Wild in one, and Medea and Fast Joe in the other, flanking the entrance. At once, they snuck close to the fence, grabbed each of the guards, and dispatched them in complete silence before pulling them out into the night. Searching the body, he found a bottle of some kind, but he couldn't quite make out what it was yet. After which, they made a mad dash through the lighted area to a bank of shadows near one of the water features. So far, so good. Maybe we can actually manage this without bringing the whole place down on us.
Chesney,
Medea whispered, pulling something from her pouch to show him.
Look at this I found on the guard.
His eyes slowly adjusted to the dark, and he took the bottle in his hand, rolling past the unreadable text to the language he understood. It read, Ibuprofen. Used only with the direction of licensed medical practitioners. Intended for medical emergencies and life-threatening injuries in the field. Capable of repairing severe organ and tissue damage with limited side effects. It is safe to use in the long term to allow the patient to be stabilized long enough to be delivered to a medical facility.
Is this what I think it is? Is there something stronger than minicetamol? And it's all, actually, safe for prolonged use, too?
Medea's grin was contagious.
Looks like it. I've never heard of it myself, but if I'm right, Mima had a bottle like this. Trust me when I say, this stuff has a real kick to it. After I had one, I'd never felt better in my life.
She noticed another bottle in Chesney's hand and gasped.
What's that? Is that another one?
He looked at the bottle he'd picked up from the guard. OMB. Biosafe organic microblasts. These pellets are a non-toxic explosive, approximately 450,000 denotion in strength. Keep out of reach of children.
Huh,
He said, turning it over in his hands.
I think these are what Smash and Gorf had. I bet these would do some serious damage. You have any idea what a denotion is, though?
She shook her head.
No clue. Maybe that's a Reagan word that doesn't really translate to what we have. Tell you what, though, let's trade. I can use these in a pinch to do some serious damage, and with the magic you use, you'll need the healing most. Hold on,
Wild whispered, a horrified look on her face.
Are you suggesting we use those on people, like, blow people up with explosives?
The pair looked at each other. Neither saw any doubt in the other's eyes. I didn't even balk at the idea. It never even occurred to me that it was wrong. What does that mean? Am I really okay with using something like that against other people? But at the same time, is burning people any better?
I understand where you are coming from,
Medea said, gently.
Maybe it's the seriousness of the task at hand that's made me change. Or maybe it's been weeks of barely surviving encounters with Zagos' forces. But using this doesn't bother me, now. A year ago, the idea would have horrified me. But now?
She looked for support from Chesney. He followed up.
You weren't there to hear Daphne's final words to us. Wild. When you get to Sasquatch, you will be completely on your own. No second chances. One mistake will end you both. You can't be fair. Be smart. Be mean. Get those artifacts at any cost.
He waited for the words to sink in.
The greatest spiritualist in the world told us to accomplish this mission by any means necessary, because the world is at stake here.
Medea finished off by putting a hand on Wild's shoulder.
I'm not exactly going to be looking to end every fight with these, Wild. But I'm not going to shy away from using it if I have to. Do you understand? Yeah, I guess,
she said, a hint of bitterness in her voice. He hated forcing her into these situations where she felt so uncomfortable, risking her life every day. He knew he should take the time to truly comfort her and allow her to come to terms with the situation. Instead, he said,
Good. We're out of time. Let's move. Follow me closely.
The path he led them through was behind a number of display cases, sandwiched between them and the outer fence wall. The grass was unkempt, and it was hard to move through. At the end of their path was a well-lit section between them and a bridge that would set them closer to the tower. They had to be absolutely sure they would not be seen. They waited there in the shadows, trying to account for the moving squads. A hand grabbed his shoulder tightly just as he began to inch forward.
Hold on, there should be another group coming up any second,
Fastjo whispered. And he was correct. A few seconds later, footsteps and laughter approached from the north. Out of the shadows, a leisurely passing squad entered the light, talking and joking. There were 3 men in full armor carrying long swords and shields, as well as 2 women with long hair and tight robes meant to be run in that looked remarkably close to thigh-slit dresses. Fastjo whispered.
These are the standard squad compositions. 3 frontline fighters, 2 backline spiritualists. There's likely going to be about 6 of these squads making regular rounds, and a 7th that will be randomly patrolling everywhere.
Chesney turned to look at him.
How do you know that?
Fastjo only shook his head.
You said standard squads. Does that mean there are non-standard squads?
Midia whispered.
Yeah, but for a place out here in the middle of nowhere, I can't imagine why there would be any. An assignment like this place would almost be considered a punishment.
How in the world does Fastjo know so much about how the SAS squad military operate? His thoughts were interrupted when the squad stopped near the displays they were hiding behind. Everyone quieted and remained completely motionless.
Ugh, I'm so sick of seeing these same displays over and over. Blah blah blah, Sophie School this and that. I could probably recite half these placards off by heart.
One of the women groused. The other woman chimed in.
I know. Like, this place was kinda neat when I was a kid, but now none of the exhibits are updated and it gets so boring. Rather be bored than listen to more of Kathy's constant bitching.
One of the men stage whispered under his breath.
What was that? Say it to my face.
The first woman yelled, stomping over to the man.
I said I'm tired of hearing you constantly complaining every single night. It's not my fault you got transferred here, but damned if I'm not paying for it anyway.
She growled, and slapped him. The tallest of the 3 men yelled, Attention! At that, the remaining 4 members of the team lined up and stood ram straight. He stood before them, silently glowering at the pair.
Unacceptable. Fighting is not tolerated here. At all. Do I make myself clear? Yes, sir,
they all said in unison.
Is this the kind of behavior Lord Zagos expects from us? No, sir. All of you, drop and give me 50.
They all silently dropped to the ground, and started their punishment.
Kathy, I see you strike another member of this squad again, and the next place I send you will make this place look like a luxury resort. And Aleem, the next time you provoke someone like that, I'll be the one to slap you, and I hit a lot harder. Any of you have a problem with how this squad operates, you bring it to me, privately. Understood? Yes, sir.
They huffed tiredly. The leader slowly paced back and forth watching them, the hard soles of his boots marking time as they labored.
Obviously, you all have a lot of free time and energy if you can complain so much. Thankfully, I can think of plenty of ways to give you something else to complain about.
Onward the leader continues, verbally berating his team until at last all 4 members had finished their 50 push-ups and stood once more at attention, puffing in the night air.
Now, we're behind in our patrol. Move it! Double time, he
commanded, and they all ran off into the dark to the south in the direction they had come. Chesney hoped in their hurry they wouldn't notice the entrance guards weren't at their posts. When the coast was clear, they dashed through the well-lit area, over the bridge, and into another darkened area near a set of displays. From their position, they could partially see some of the displays that were on the opposite side of the path. Ancient, decayed artifacts in some, and remarkably almost new-looking ones in others. Midia shook her head, disgust on her face.
Look at all these artifacts, all locked away and hidden from everyone now. They're keeping history to themselves. And worse yet, If this really was once the site of a school started by the Great Ones, look how they've desecrated it with their weapons and fences. Consecrated grounds indeed.
Vasjo shared in her ire.
I think you'll find, the longer you're here in Sasquatch, how history is subtly being rewritten.
In other times and circumstances, Chesney would have been fascinated by all of this. He knew that his knowledge of the Great Ones was lacking, and considering how much their deeds and works seemed to be involved in the present conflict, he was sure the knowledge contained here would be invaluable to him. He racked his brain, trying to find a way to both get the helm and study all the lore here, but he couldn't think of a way that wasn't sure to get them captured and betray their greater purpose. He instead led them past wonder after wonder as though they were the merest trifles, skulking in shadow whenever possible, and dashing like frightened mice when they could not. Though the way was not easy, they at last drew close enough to the base of the tower and found the entrance unguarded. The building was oddly welcoming, owing back to its roots as the main attraction at a museum and heritage site. A polished stone facade, with sharp, clean corners, drew them to a set of double doors carved with a design. The figure of a divine woman, for she had a halo of light about her head, with palms open and welcoming, and a half-dozen smiling children about her and reaching towards her. If this was indeed previously the location of a school, presumably Sophie's, how had the helm come to be here? Had Cormu also been a teacher of some kind? The legends never gave any hint at such a thing. But really, what could legends tell? Legends told of Cormu slaying Strabo, and yet it had cursed Gabnid. So much of the history of Lennis was lost, never to be recovered. And on top of that, places like this were desecrating that history further. What other blasphemies were in store on this damned continent? Quietly, he tried the door, finding it unlocked. Even more luck. The lobby was completely empty of life. It was, however, well lit, and had the feel of a room that saw life regularly, and it was impossible to shed the feeling that at any moment someone would walk inside and find them here. The floor was carpeted. Each of the displays were glass and polished wood. The walls were painted a welcoming, unobtrusive pale blue. Vasjo silently pointed at the stairs, then at his head. They all understood. They all proceeded as silent as the night up the stairs, though he saw Medea despondently looking at the priceless artifacts as they passed, as though each one were some cherished possessions she had no choice but to abandon. Upstairs had fewer displays. Everything was arrayed to draw attention to the greatest artifact the site held. Cormu's helm. It stood, alone, on a plain white, cylindrical pedestal, lit by brilliant spotlights. The helm was like nothing he had ever seen, and yet it was instantly obvious just how much it paired with the strangely metallic organic design of the sword. Polished and gleaming, it seemed impossibly well preserved for an artifact of such great antiquity, as though Cormu had only just put it on the pedestal and would be back for it shortly. How to describe such alien art? It was a full helmet, meant to cover the whole of the head and face. Some strange dark metal, blue to the point it was almost black. Soft curves that joined beautifully to form artistic creases. The front of the helm was of a different material, like glass, but not. It was dark and reflective at once, like a mirror bent to fill the space where the face would be, though he strongly doubted the material would be nearly so fragile as that. The back of the helm was decorated with subtle ridges that wrapped around the side, and joined again at the front, just under the chin. Over all was embossed a subtle design, accented in gold, of nothing in particular other than to be beautiful and dashing. After everything that Chesney had been through, he was sure that seeing the helm would affect him in some way. He had touched the panel. He now wielded the sword. The headmaster, Daphne, and even Strabo had hinted at some greater destiny afoot in all this. But there was no drawing force of familiarity, only the awe of seeing time's decay thwarted, and ancient history become real. He was at once relieved, disappointed, and scared. Shouldn't there be something? He couldn't shake that terrifying feeling that this was all wrong, that he was all wrong, that whatever the world needed, it wasn't him, but somehow he had gotten involved instead, and the true savior had died or was never found. The silence of the room was shattered when a deep man's voice called out from beside them.
"You vile, traitorous thieves!"
The voice came from a giant of a feet or a man, easily a head and a half taller than Chesney, clad in fine, unblemished armor, wielding an exceptionally long and thin sword, and the armored carapace on his forehead polished to a mirror shine. He eyed them all coldly and stepped in their path with heavy steps.
"I will never allow one such as you so much as touch the great works that our Lord Zakos has given to his people."
He brandished his weapon in a stance Chesney had never seen before that gave him pause.
"So, come. If you think you can come take it, show me what you can do."
Chesney was sure they would win. It was 4 against 1, as strong as this one was. The issue at hand was how fast they could win, fast enough that no one would hear the fight, or raise the alarm for missing guards.
"Everyone, 2 in front, 2 in,"
he began to order, when beside him Medea yelled,
"Freeze!"
Mid-strike, the guardian of the helm stopped in time. Fastjo, always quick to react, leapt forward and delivered a severe blow to the man's neck. Frozen in time as he was, the blow made no evidence of damage. Yet, after witnessing the cruel yet effective use of magic, Chesney was once again struck with awe at the power the spirits afforded them. With only half the spirit at his disposal, Chesney could freeze time, run an attack at great speed, use 3 different elements of attack, and even corrupt the defenses of his foes. Even with just this, the powers at his disposal were truly terrifying. Doing quick math in his head, the remaining spirits would not double his power, but quadruple it. What great yet terrible powers would they be forced to employ next on their journey? But this was not the time to dwell on such things. A second later, time resumed for their foe. A deep gash opened across his throat, and the man stumbled, dropping his sword in shock, and trying in vain like a drowning man to hold the blood in his body. The effort was useless, though. His life literally ran between his fingers, and he quickly collapsed to the ground making awful gurgling sounds. Wild turned away, covering her mouth in horror. Chesney stepped over the man and stood before the helm. Though he felt like a grave robber touching it, he wasted no time in removing his own helm, and donning the ancient armor. Luxuries like shame and awe were something he could ill afford now, though his heart panged regardless at seeing drops of the guardian's blood had splattered upon it. When the helm was on his head, he was amazed but not surprised that the reflective part of the helm was transparent to him. He also felt something strange, an enhanced awareness, almost like he had a much greater feel for what was going on around him, even behind him. He turned, feeling something moving, and saw that the dying man had crawled a few feet away. There was something cuboid in his hand. With half-lidded eyes, the man looked at him, mouthed a bitter curse, and pressed something on the object in his hand. He at last expired. In the next second, a blaring siren wail erupted all around them, louder and quieter, repeating in pattern, sounding like nothing Chesney had ever heard before.
"Chesney, it's an alarm. The whole base will be on us in a moment,"
Fastjo cried.
"What do we do?"
All at once, the realization crashed upon him that the worst-case scenario was about to come to pass. How many patrols had there been? 7? With 5 members each? Not counting those who had been sleeping. 40 people? More? All coming at them. 3 pairs of eyes filled with dawning realization bored into his mask. Think! If we can hold them off for 2 minutes, Fastjo could perhaps have us escape with his magic. But that would mean barricading us all in here and defending this spot. How likely is it that there is only one entrance? Or that nothing else would go wrong while Fastjo cast the spell? On the other hand, if we started running, right now, we could face the squads before they had a chance to group. If we're lucky, we wouldn't even face half of them by the time we got to the exit. How was he supposed to decide? How could he know which had the better chance? "I'm going to get everyone killed."
"Buffs,"
he said, his voice almost cracking. Nobody reacted.
"Everyone, buffs." Now.
The shock finally wore off at his shout. In seconds, they were all faster, and stronger, and hardier. This will have to be enough.
Behind me. Run!
He cried, dashing towards the stairs, and everyone followed half a step behind. He continued his orders.
Hold nothing back. Pop as many pills as you have to. Crash into anything we meet with overpowering force, and push through. Do not stop.
In the blink of an eye, they were outside, the siren's wail echoing through the night. Shouts and movement were everywhere. There was no time to stop and assess where they were coming from. There was only forward. A squad of men and women just rounded the corner of the tower as they got out the door. A shrill whistle cut through the air.
There they are.
Chesney's pace didn't slow a fraction. There was no way around. There was only through. Two men stood ready, swords mid-swing. He slashed at them both horizontally with the sword of the ancient hero. Their swords shattered with ease, and the cut slid deep into both their chests as though they wore no armor at all. In the next step, he shoved the two corpses that had yet to realize they were dead into the two spiritualist women behind them. Surprised mid-spell, they were stunned and tried to hold up their comrades. In the next step, twin break spells tore through the squad like a tornado, tossing body and limb like leaves in the wind. They were through. But now everyone knew exactly where they were. Their mad rush to the exit were punctuated flashes of consciousness, moments in time. A dodge there, a slash, a blast of flames. But always enduring, always fighting, always running, forward, over through, always through. Arrows appeared in faces between glances, scorch marks, cuts, flying limbs and sprays of blood. With every blink, a new wound on a foe before them, or an opponent felled and cast aside. If he received wounds, they did not reach him now. Whenever he felt his steps slow, or his limbs refuse his commands, he would lift his helm and swallow another pill. How many had fallen before them? Been left behind? He did not know. For all he knew, there was a growing army at their heels. But his thoughts could not grasp such concepts now. What he did notice, though, was that his body seemed to at times move, or be pushed, without his direct conscious intervention. Blows on him that would have connected now failed with a slight turn of the head, or barest move of an inch to the side. There was no doubt that in some way, this was the work of Cormu's helm. Ahead, a huge group, more than he could count. There was yelling. Was it him? A hand grabbed him by the arm, and he whipped around to see.
Chesney, stop,
Medea said between gulping breaths. Smoking holes pockmarked her armor, and there's a nasty-looking blackened wound on her face, and another larger one over her forearm. Turning to look at his team, everyone was doubled over, gasping for breath, looking back and forth wearily at the forces around them. Fascio and Wild were almost back to back. His cutlass was at the ready, and his keen eyes took in every detail. Wild, teeth grit, notched 3 arrows, aiming into the crowd. She was whispering something to herself, almost like a chant, though he couldn't quite make it out. She seemed on the verge of panicking. Each had a half a score of cuts, dripping blood onto the walkway. Then, he looked down at himself, and was horrified. His armor was barely holding on. He had no recollection of receiving any of these blows. His shield was partially crumpled. There was a long gash on his right leg that was filling his boot with blood so fast that some squished out when he changed his footing. His sleeves and chest were just dark red. The grip of the sword in his hand, warm and sticky. They were surrounded. The exit to the compound was blocked by a dozen fresh Fee Orla soldiers, and half that in combat spiritualists. Behind them, another half-dozen were at the ready, evidently survivors of their escape thus far, that had given chase judging by how out of breath they were. A man stepped forward from the group guarding the exit, and shouted,
"Put down your weapons and surrender immediately. This is your only warning, rebel scum."
The spiritualists behind him were all ready to fire bolts of lightning, with their hands pointing right at Chesney, crackling in the night. Doubtless, those behind were too. Chesney whispered,
"Be ready."
Chesney stepped forward, right in the exact center of the crowd. Loudly, he said,
"How do I know you won't just kill us?" "Oh, we won't kill you."
The apparent leader sneered.
"You can beg like animals before Lord Zagos to spare your lives. Who knows? Maybe he'll have mercy? Now, drop your weapons. How about this? Counteroffer. Move out of the way, and nobody else has to die. Just say we got away, and everyone gets to go home today. You're a fool if you think I'll just let you walk away from here. With that,"
he yelled, pointing at the helm.
"Well, I had to ask,"
Chesney said. Flick blood off the blade, turning it over and stabbing it into a patch of soft, muddy dirt. The air began to get hot. His eyes flashed. He screamed,
"Now!"
and thrust his hands to either side. Fire and light, at his call, filled the night with countless explosions. Chaos ensued. The enemy was knocked back into each other, interrupting spells, tripping in their attempts to charge his position. A heartbeat later, the crowd was overtaken with huge bolts of lightning. Anywhere a squad was beginning to gain their footing.
"This is how you use lightning,"
Medea cried out from behind him. Blasts of warped reality hammered into the surrounding squads faster than Chesney had ever seen wild cast spells. She was screaming and turning everywhere, barely even registering what she was doing. But the crowd wasn't powerless. One swordsman and 2 witches got through, and crashed upon him with a duo of lightning bolts to his chest, and a diagonal slash at his neck. The 2 bolts landed, and he used the momentum of the blows to help him roll away from the slash. The sword was out of reach, but that didn't matter. He was done playing. He was done being nice. He was done with Zagos, all of it. Though his body ached with burns, bruises, and gashes, though his vision was dark around the edges and there was never enough air, he didn't want to be smart, to push past them, and fight his way to freedom. He wanted to be mean. He summoned up every last motive life left to him, stared with eyes full of hate at the trio coming to cut him down, and used his most powerful spell once more.
"I warned you,"
he screamed, and then the whole base filled with an uncountably infinite array of small explosions. Display cases, lights, bodies, all shattered. Screams and the sounds of battle reached their peak, and then, all was silence. Chesney fell prone to the ground. Somehow, after everything he had endured on their mad escape, using his most life-draining spell twice, while also taking direct blows in between, he had held on. Weak hands fumbled to his helmet, trying to push it off, to get more air. Medea was beside him.
"It's okay. I've got you,"
she soothed, taking off the helmet for him, reaching to his belt for the ibuprofen, practically shoving a pill of it into his mouth. His life returned to him like a sledgehammer to the chest. His heart pumped madly for a few moments, before finally relenting. He still felt utterly exhausted in a way that a healed body could never remedy, though.
"Are we okay? Did the rest run away?"
he asked, as she gently stroked his hair out of his face. Medea bit her lip and looked around. Her face told him there was something she didn't know how to tell him.
"Medea, what's wrong? You can tell me anything. You know that."
At last she said, softly,
"Chesney, there's no one else. Everyone in the base is dead. We're safe." What?
He stammered, sitting up abruptly. Everywhere he turned his head was destruction. Shattered glass and shattered bodies. What had he really expected, in that moment? He wanted to believe that his plan all along was a tremendous show of force to have everyone run. But, was that really what it was in the end? Hadn't he really wanted this? To pay someone back for every wrong that had happened? Hadn't he wanted to be mean? To be vicious and cruel to those sneering soldiers who thought they had them cornered? Seeing the terrible destruction he had wrought, All he could do was remember the memories of picking through the ruins of the magic school. Only this time, he really was the cause. Him, and his direct decisions. What have I done? He refused to say the words out loud, to let them be real. I did this. I cannot look away. He began to stand. Medea followed his movements with great concern, like she was afraid he was a house of cards that would collapse at the slightest tremor. He hated that she thought he was weak like that. To his surprise, there was a set of running footsteps behind him, and then he was practically plowed right over when Wild held him in a fierce hug.
Chesney, I can't believe it! Look at all this!
She cried, her voice shaking, but at the same time, filled with a tiny sliver of the exuberant awe she was known for. Look at this indeed, he thought.
You saved us, Chesney. I was so scared.
She told him, unable to let him go. Carefully he reciprocated, though being hugged by a taller woman was a bit awkward.
The whole time we were sneaking in, it was like I could barely walk forward, feeling like something terrible was just waiting to happen. I could barely focus back there while we were running. All I could think was that.
Her voice broke, then continued, shakily.
That we were going to die, or be captured, or worse.
Over Wild's shoulder, he could see that Medea's face was a mix of emotions, though he was unable to read them. She backed away a step, then went to check on Fast Joe.
All I could do was just keep staring at your back. I felt safe, almost, knowing you were still standing, cutting down everything in your way. But when we were cornered, that horrible feeling came crashing down again, and I just knew we were all going to die. I kept saying to myself, over and over, them or me, like you said, trying to hold on. And then you told us to be ready, and you just walked into the middle of all that without any fear at all. Chesney, it was incredible. But, are you okay, Wild? I know how you felt about having to maybe hurt people. Yeah, I'm okay. Well, I know that I will be,
she said, finally letting him go.
I don't know, up until we got the helmet, all of the squads of soldiers were people we needed to avoid. But after the alarm, it was like a switch flipped. It's kinda hard to explain.
He shook his head.
It's okay, Wild. You don't have to. We did what we had to do. All that matters is everyone is safe. We accomplished our mission, and we know what to do next. Speaking of which, we need to get out of here as quickly as possible. Who knows when more people will come?
And I don't want them to see us with all this. He put the helmet back on, wiping blood off the visor, and turned to find Medea and Fast Joe had joined them. He passed out 3 pills to everyone and watched in amazement as even the deadliest wounds seemed to clear up in seconds. Their clothes and armor were all still in desperate need of repair, though. Fast Joe sighed and shook his head.
Well, that sure brought up some bad memories.
At everyone's quizzical look, he shook his head.
Not here. We'll talk later.
They began to walk out the exit. Gruesome though it was, there were a pile of bodies they needed to walk over to get there. Wild gagged when she almost fell on top of the body of one of the spiritualists, but Medea was there to catch her. Fast Joe looked a bit dejected but said nothing else. Chesney and Medea did not look away. They all walked in silence until the compound was a distant twinkling of lights behind them.
And, how are you holding up, Medea?
He asked, now that they had a bit of space where they could talk. He couldn't well see her face in the darkness of the night, though the dawn was slowly approaching enough for him to more easily make out her silhouette. She was looking down. There was a long pause.
I don't know.
She managed.
I don't know how to say this without sounding awful, or whiny, or... I don't know. Medea, don't be silly. You could tell me anything, and I'd support you.
She swallowed.
I know. And, thank you. I can't really tell you how much that means to me, knowing I can count on you like that.
Haltingly, she continued.
I guess. The easiest way to say it is, I feel kind of scared. Because we could have died.
He asked, adding as much softness to his voice as he could, as weary as he was. She laughed quietly, and with a hint of bitterness.
No. I'm scared because none of that bothered me. That man guarding the helm? I didn't even hesitate. I just froze him, watched Fast Joe cut his throat, and watched him bleed out on the ground. And as we ran, I wasn't scared. I was determined. Clinical. Analytical. The only thing I was scared of was making sure you didn't run into too much danger or overexert yourself.
Before he could say anything else, she continued.
And at the end, when they were all dead, and I knew you were still alive, all I could think of was, good. They're all dead. We're safe. How horrible is that? I just helped kill almost 40 people. And my biggest concern was wondering how you would take it.
They walked for another 20 paces before he could answer.
You're worried you're a monster.
It wasn't a question. Her voice hitched, but it came out as a whisper as she said,
Yes. Well, if you are, I am too. But I don't think we are.
She didn't reply. He continued to explain.
You hated them, didn't you? Because they tried to kidnap you.
Again, not a question. He saw her wrap her arms around herself.
I just can't forget it. The terror of being carried away, in the middle of the night, feeling helpless, and like I'd never see my father again. And that mob in Barsus. They would have killed us, strung us up like some kinds of trophies for their damn Lord Zagos. All I could think was that these people had no remorse in their hearts, and deserved to die for what they tried to do to me. It's the same for me. I know it's wrong. I know that these people weren't the ones who hurt me. Hurt you. But they were in my way, and I'd make them pay for it all anyway.
He wrapped his arm around her shoulder, and they walked on in silence as she shook in the quiet darkness. That's when it all went to hell. Hissing voices out in the dark shouted,
For Lord Zagos, you shall die?
He got a glimpse of men in tight-fitting martial arts uniforms emerging from the darkness, faces covered in long cloths. Then, a blow struck him, and everything went black. Medea watched in horror as a black-clad figure emerged from the darkness of a pre-dawn night, and with a single blow sent Chesney spinning to the ground. He did not rise. He did not move. He was deathly still.
No! No!
She screamed, desperate to fall to his side. But in the next instant, the figure was in her path, hand stretched and a clawed strike ready for her chest. From what she could tell, these were fearless soldiers, but their armor was unlike the others. Tight-fitting cloth, layered with light armored patches for maximum movement. They carried no weapons, only their fists. Their faces were pale, tattooed with a pattern that made it seem like they had 3 pairs of eyes. And over their faces were long pale cloths that covered their mouths and draped low in a way that seemed almost ceremonial. Fast Joe yelled out,
No, I don't believe it. It's one of Zagos's personal assassin squad. These guys are beyond deadly. They can kill with a single strike.
He and Wild faced off against the other figure. Her blood ran cold. Kill? Could Chesney be? No. No. I don't believe it. Her skin was hot and ice-cold at once, and she needed to be at his side. There was no way. No way he could be taken from her just like that. The figure before Medea readied his hands into vicious-looking claws, and stood ready to pounce. He hissed in a raspy voice,
We are Lord Zagos's masters of the Spirit Fist. For desecrating the consecrated grounds, you all shall die by our hands.
She couldn't take her eyes away from Chesney's body, though. Move. Please. Move. Chesney. Show me you're okay. Please. The master assassin stepped forward and threw a blow to her chest. She was unable to move, paralyzed by her own fear.
Medea! Look out!
Wild cried from somewhere behind her, and an arrow whipped by her ear, almost hitting her attacker, who flipped back out of the way, His attack stalled. A second later, Wild cried out and fell. She turned, to see that the second man had gotten behind Wild, while she was distracted and struck her. Like a puppet with its strings cut, she too fell to the ground, unmoving. Her horror at the sight, the result of her own inability to react, was unspeakable. There were no words left to describe the shame at seeing two of her friends die in front of her and being unable to act. A wordless sob escaped her lips, and it transformed into a raging battle cry. Her two hands lit with powerful arcing lightning. She swung clumsy, emotional punches, missing by a mile every time.
So weak,
the assassin hissed, laughing. Then he leaped forward with incredible speed, claws shooting forward and raining down strikes faster than she could blink. Absolute terror gripped her heart, knowing that a single blow would end her. She dodged desperately, backing up and flinging her body this way and that to avoid not just this blow, but the one that would follow. From behind her, she heard clashing steel, but she could not look now. Anything other than perfect accuracy, and she would die. Then, a dual cry of pain. Fascio and his assailant cried out together. A body slumped to the ground. Only one. It was 2 against 1, now. But who had the advantage? A grunt from behind her. A limping step. She knew in her heart that somehow, Fascio had faltered, but injured the other. She had seconds to live. Her friends were dead, or dying. She was stranded in a foreign land. 2 murderers were at her throat, and her Chesney lay still on the ground. A small part of her wanted to break down, fall to her knees, and accept the inevitable, to fall in the dirt and give in to the sweet poison promises of despair. But a much larger part wanted revenge before the end, and that part of her that wanted to kill knew what to do. Like a fog had been lifted from her mind. That need to take vengeance cleared away all other thoughts. There was left only clarity. Clarity of thought, dexterity of movement, the single line towards victory. She waited for that little shift in her foe's strike that would signal the other was behind her. Then she threw herself to the ground between them, closed her eyes, and blasted them both with lightning, roughly where she estimated their faces to be. She heard 2 synchronous screams. Opening her eyes, she saw them both staggering back and clutching at their faces. She swung her leg into the ankle of one that had been behind her. There was a disgusting pop. With a yell, he fell to the ground hard. Not losing an ounce of that momentum, Medea swung herself around and flipped to deliver another crushing blow to the man's throat with her heel. 1. The first, still blind from the bright flash in the dark and maddened by the pain of the bolt, lashed out in every direction, spewing fire from his fists in frantic arcs. All of them missed her as she crawled on the ground. Then she saw his face. His eyes were a smoldering ruin. She yelled,
"Freeze!"
For a moment, he seemed to slow, but resumed again.
"There you are, you little bitch!"
he yelled. A second later, the ground was a boiling sea of fire, and it was her turn to scream in agony. Scrambling to her feet with limbs that barely listened, she choked back further cries of pain. She needed to keep him in the dark. Her foes seemed to catch on. He ceased his thrashing, and instead stayed very silent and began to walk and turn in slow circles.
"You think I haven't trained to fight blind, child? Fool. Dut. I'm going to pluck your eyes from their sockets and make you eat them. Feel them pop inside your precious little mouth."
She wanted to crow that at least she still had her eyes, but she resisted. That's what he was hoping for. To give herself away. She would not. Not until the end. Silently this time, she thrust out her hands and felt the spirit of Sphere churn hungrily within her. Freeze! Again, the man began to slow, but resisted. She cursed something awful in her head. Still, he was vaguely able to sense her direction from the attack, and sent another wave of fire. Parts of it singed her skin where it already burned like fire, and she wanted to cry out from quadrupled pain. But again she stayed quiet.
"I won't miss you forever, you little rat.
The man hissed in his raspy voice, turning around slowly, stepping quietly. There, with his back turned to her, she tried once more. Please work. Freeze. She poured all her desperation into her call to the spirit.
Ah-ha!
He yelled, snapping in her direction, but mid-turn his voice began to slow and trail away, and at last he was frozen in time. My turn, you monster! Despite her burns, her pain, and exhaustion, she grabbed up her staff and ran to his frozen form. Over and over, she brought it down on his hands, wrists, ankles, legs, elbows, and knees. When time resumed, the air resounded with a sickening crack as all his limbs crumpled at once, and he collapsed into a heap of broken bones and pain. The man screamed, the pain overwhelming him. His every struggle brought forth a new wave of agony, and at last he lay unmoving, sobbing through gnashing teeth. Calmly, Medea filled her body with warmth from the crown. She let him watch as all the wounds and burns lightened and melted away into nothing, though at the end she remembered he no longer had eyes to see.
Wretched child, what are you?
She didn't answer. Steadily, she stepped behind him.
What are you doing?
Small hands, trembling with uncontained rage, gripped both sides of his head in an iron grip. In quiet anger, she whispered,
Die.
And then filled his skull with light. After the grim deed was done, each breath drained her of more and more of her rage, and what was replacing it was a horrid mix of fear, despair, and remorse. In a field of still forms, she finally collapsed to the ground and wept.
No,
she yelled at herself.
Not yet. I have to be sure.
She leaped to her feet, and it felt as though she sailed through the air to be at Chesney's side in a single stride. Like a woman possessed, she groped at his neck, feeling for a pulse. She could barely feel for her trembling, but she mastered herself and held her fingers against his artery. After the third faint beat, she almost broke down again. There was no cost too high for her to pay to see him live again. If her body thinned out into nothingness from the crown's power, so be it. A veritable tidal wave of life-giving energy crashed into his body through her hand, and still more she pressed into him until his body felt almost too full of it that he might burst. At last he took a deep, gasping breath and lurched forward to cough. She grabbed him just to feel the life of his body, and wept into his robes. Thank you, Sophie. Thank you. Thank you. Renewed in seeing her Chesney rise from the brink of death, she stumbled to Wilde's body. Not even waiting to feel for a pulse, she hammered more life-giving energy into the woman's body. She was so grateful to her, and ashamed at once. Wilde had saved her life at the cost of her own. She would see this undone. No fatigue overtook her. She pumped life into Wilde until she too stirred. At last, fast Joe. There was blood on the end of his blade, but it seemed as though the cost was a broken wrist, and a death blow. Had he not been able to delay and deal critical damage to the other assassin, she was sure she would be dead. Fast Joe, please, come back. Don't die on me, please. He took the longest. Maybe he had been wounded the worse. Maybe she was out of the boundless energy that drove her on. But long moments of stillness persevered. Her heart was tearing itself apart, seeing his body unmoving. Please, Sophie. I don't want to lose anyone. She hammered his chest, screaming,
Please.
At last he jolted awake, coughing.
Ow.
He managed. Around her, 3 of 5 forms now began to stand. Somehow, she had done it. Against all odds. Alone. She had overcome and brought them back from the brink of destruction. Chesney staggered over, helm held under his arm. He looked like death, but his skin was becoming flusher with every moment.
What happened here?
He said, looking around him at the dead bodies of the assassins, and his comrades getting to their feet. Medea could not answer. She could only cover her face and cry. Her heart ached with 1,000 fears and hurts. Moments later, Chesney's arms were wrapped around her, and she spent her tears into his shoulder. If he so much as moved, she clutched his robes and held him firmly against her. She needed to feel the beating of his heart against her, or it would all be some cruel nightmare, and he would be dead in her hands. Dawn came and passed, and the heat of morning was strong before they were away at last.